welcome to Scottish Murders. I'm Dawn, and this is the final roundup part episode of the Pat McAdam disappearance. So far, we've heard how Pat McAdam disappeared on Sunday the 19th of February 1967, after travelling back from a night out in Glasgow with her friend Hazel, after the pair were picked up by lorry driver Thomas Ross Young, with Hazel being dropped off in Annan and then waving Pat and Thomas off after Thomas said that he would drop Pat off at her home in Dundee, which was 16 miles away. But Pat was never seen again, despite a large-scale police search. Many sightings leading nowhere. Dedicated journalist Frank Ryan keeping the case in the public eye for decades. Clairvoyant Gerard Quasi becoming involved, the lorry driver Thomas Ross Young being questioned multiple times, and Pat's mum and dad actually visiting Thomas's then wife Annie and asking her to speak to Thomas and find out if he had any involvement in Pat's disappearance, which Annie did, but Thomas refused to speak about it. In the previous episodes, we heard just what Gerard Quasi brought to the investigation, and we heard all about Thomas Young, the lorry driver, and the last known person to have seen Pat McAdam alive. And we found out just what he was like, taking us up to October 1977, when he was found guilty of 1 murder, 2 attempted murders, and 3 rapes, being sentenced to 30 years, which was reduced to 25 on appeal. We'll pick back up in September 1981, as for the first time since Pat's disappearance, after the murder trial, there was very little mention about her disappearance until September 1981. Let's get started. Back in episode 1, I talked about Pat's mum Mary and dad Matthew, and how they travelled hundreds of miles around the country, searching, speaking to and questioning as many people as they could, in the hope of finding their daughter. But that Matthew was deeply affected by his daughter's disappearance, and he was hospitalised twice, before finally sadly dying in August 1969. Well, Pat's case was next in the newspapers on Sunday, the 13th of September 1981, when it was reported in the Sunday Post that, sadly, Pat's mum Mary had died in hospital, saying that this was the final sad twist in Pat's case. Little did that reporter know that while that was incredibly sad, it most definitely would not be the final twist in Pat McAdam's case, despite it being reported in the Daily Record in February 1987, 20 years after Pat's disappearance, that even though Pat's case was still technically open, detectives did not expect any further developments. And that seemed to be what was going to happen, as Pat's case, just like Pat, simply disappeared, until November 2004, 37 and a half years after Pat went missing, when an article appeared in the Aberdeen Press and Journal stating that a 70-year-old man had been charged with Pat McAdam's disappearance and murder. But after such a long time, and detectives clearly saying, back in 1987, that they didn't expect any further developments, what had happened? Well, in July 2004, an inquiry team led by retired Superintendent Bill Gillies and Detective Chief Inspector Gary Small was set up to review and catalogue all documentation related to Pat's disappearance. This inquiry was known as Operation Trucker, and it included interviews being carried out with retired police officers who had been involved in the initial inquiry. It was following this 4-month-long inquiry that new evidence was unearthed that led to the yet unnamed 70-year-old man being charged with Pat McAdam's disappearance and murder, with Detective Chief Inspector Gary Small saying that we have really brought the inquiry up to modern standards, and that the breakthrough came from re-examining the original evidence and speaking to the original witnesses from 1967. While he didn't say what this new evidence was, he did say that modern science has played a part, but the arrest we have made is not DNA related at this time. I wonder what that new evidence was then that wasn't DNA related, but hadn't been uncovered at the time of the original inquiry. Despite this dramatic development in the case and a man being charged, it was reported that police were prepared to take their time, saying that it could be weeks before a report would be sent to the Procurator Fiscal, or that the man charged appeared in court. According to Detective Chief Inspector Gary Small, this was due to the fact that we are still following up a number of lines of inquiry, and there are still a number of people we wish to speak to who were involved with the case back in 1967. Apparently, they were finding difficulty with this due to the number of years that had passed and people having died or moved away from the area. Now, that was the 27th of November 2004 that the police said that they were preparing to take their time. And it wouldn't be until September 2007, almost 3 years later, that this 70-year-old pensioner, now having been named as Thomas Ross Young, appeared, according to the Daily Record, via video link from Peterhead Prison at Dumfries Sheriff Court, officially charged with having murdered Pat McAdam on the 19th of February 1967, to which Thomas Young made no plea. Imagine being Pat's remaining family, having their hopes raised after so many years that finally it looked like Pat was to receive justice, despite her body never having been found. Imagine waiting from November 2004 to September 2007 to finally see the man they long suspected had been involved in Pat's disappearance and murder finally be named and appear in court officially charged with her murder. Imagine how Pat's two sisters, Wendy and Eleanor, and brother Neil felt after so long, almost 40 years, after having their sister taken from them and having lost both of their parents. Just imagine. Now think about how they would feel when 11 months later, in August 2008, they were told by the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service that no indictment is to be served meantime on Thomas Ross Young. Let me tell you why. Remember I said that the new evidence that led to Thomas Young's charge wasn't DNA related? Well, from that we have to assume that perhaps a new witness had been uncovered, or an original witness had remembered something they hadn't at the time. It has never been disclosed what this evidence was, so that is just a guess if it wasn't related to DNA. So the first part I'm going to talk about shouldn't have been the reason for the COPFS's decision not to go ahead and indict Thomas Young, but the second part definitely could be. Everything was thrown up into the air in September 2007 at Angus Sinclair's trial for the murders of Helen Scott and Christine Eadie in 1977, when it was shockingly thrown out. Again, I covered this in depth in our linked or not linked episode, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but basically the case was thrown out due to insufficiency of evidence, and the Crown putting forward a completely circumstantial case. The fallout, though, from this was huge, with Scottish Parliament getting involved, and eventually, according to Wikipedia, leading to the Double Jeopardy Scotland Act 2011 being passed, which meant that people convicted or acquitted of an offence could be prosecuted again, which in turn led to Angus Sinclair being charged again for the murders of Helen Scott and Christine Eadie, with that trial being held in 2014 and him being found guilty. But back in 2007, the initial murder trial of Helen Scott and Christine Eadie being thrown out had repercussions, including previous charges against individuals for a serious crime and who were awaiting trial, now not going ahead, which also included Thomas Young not being indicted for Pat McAdam's disappearance and murder. Following the shock and embarrassment of the murder trial against Angus Sinclair in 2007 being thrown out, the Crown Office carried out an internal review of the handling of this case. When the outcome of this review was published, which included recommendations and improvements, legal experts believed that going forward, it would make it very difficult for action to be taken on historical unsolved cases, which came to be the case the following year when a number of indictments were dropped, including Thomas Young's. A professor in Scottish law at Edinburgh University said in the Herald newspaper just how this report would make it difficult for historical cases to be solved now, due to difficulties in preserving DNA evidence and the ability of an accused's defence to highlight flaws in witness recall. Going on to say that, after decades, people's memories fade and the Crown Office must ask whether the evidence is now strong enough for there to be any reasonable likelihood of a conviction. as there's no use putting a prosecution witness through the ordeal of a trial if they are going to be crucified by the defence about what they saw and knew, but may have forgotten. He went on to say that if there are clear DNA profiles, it's easier, but that if a case is dependent on eyewitness testimony alone, the more difficult it is for the jury to be satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that it would be a safe conviction. While that does make sense and could potentially lead to less people being convicted of a crime they didn't commit, what about those who did commit a crime many decades ago and could now potentially get away with it? Following the decision to not indict Thomas Young for Pat McAdam's disappearance and murder, retired Detective Superintendent Bill Gillies, who led the reinvestigation into Pat's murder, which had been a thorough and painstaking reinvestigation that had received massive help and support from the public, said the whole point was to bring some closure to Pat's family. I feel sorry for them. They have been looking for somewhere to grieve, but have not been able to do it. When Pat's family were asked to comment on the decision, Pat's sister, Wendy's husband, said that the whole case has been going on far too long. She will not comment. Pat's other siblings, Eleanor and Neil, declined to comment as well. I too feel sorry for what Pat's family had gone through. Having their hopes raised and dashed so many times over the years must have been hellish. And despite that, they're still no further forward. Pat's body still hasn't been found, and her murderer has not been brought to justice. After that, there was very little mention again of Pat's case, other than occasional articles on anniversaries, but never with any new information being reported, other than in the Daily Record on the 23rd of February 2011, when it said in an article that apparently Thomas Young was suffering from a heart condition and that he was too ill to stand trial. This had never been mentioned before. So, had the Crown Office decided not to indict Thomas Young on Pat's murder because he had a heart condition? I don't believe that. Surely, if there was enough evidence, then regardless of his heart condition, he should still stand trial. Yes? I mean, Rennie and Andrew McRae's murderer stood trial when he was 81, and he did not look well at all, dying in prison 5 months after being found guilty of their murder. Although what a Crown Office spokesperson said in this same article in 2011 did give me pause. They said, following full and careful consideration of all the facts and circumstances in this case, Crown Counsel instructed that there be no proceedings against this individual meantime. But they did go on to say that the Crown specifically reserves the right to re-raise proceedings should further evidence come to light. So while the first part of that statement made me think, what circumstances are you talking about? Thomas's heart condition? But the latter part of the statement about them reserving the right to re-raise proceedings suggests that perhaps at that time it was felt that there just wasn't enough evidence to convict at a trial. But retired Detective Superintendent Bill Gillies seemed to be so very positive that they did have enough evidence to proceed to a trial. Perhaps before Angus Sinclair's trial was thrown out, the Crown might have been more confident to go ahead with the evidence that had been found against Thomas Young, but after that, and the report being produced, things had changed. If that was the case, then Angus Sinclair's thrown-out trial really did impact so many others. And sadly, that's how things were going to stay. There will be no further hope of Pat McAdam's murderer ever being brought to justice, as Thomas Ross Young died in prison on the 14th of July 2014, still protesting his innocence about the murder of Francis Barker, and never having been brought to justice if he did kill Pat McAdam, which is what many believe in their heart. Pat McAdam had been missing, presumed dead at that time, for 47 years. Okay, so not quite finished yet. I've still got a question or two to ask before the end. But I was really happy to find in another article about Pat's murder in the Herald in February 2007 a further statement from the Crown Office which read, "There was insufficient evidence to prosecute Thomas Ross Young for the murder of Pat McAdam. This decision was based solely on the evidence in this case." I was so pleased to read that. It put to bed any thoughts that the decision had been made due to Thomas Young's heart condition. So many people were touched by Pat McAdam's disappearance. Her family, obviously. The reporter, Frank Ryan, who tried his best to keep her story in the public eye. All the police officers and detectives who worked on her case over the years. Dutch clairvoyant Gerard Quasi, and even Pat's potential murderer's wife, Annie Young. So many people kept Pat in their hearts and never forgot about her, and who all believed that Thomas Young held the key to Pat McAdam's disappearance. The initial investigating officer, Detective Kevin Cullinan, who moved to live and work in Botswana, continued to think about the case and said that everything pointed to Thomas Young and that he definitely could have cleared up the mystery. Thomas Young's ex-wife Annie believed then and still believes that Thomas was hiding something about Pat's disappearance and that he was a man without conscience. The retired officer who led the re-investigation into Pat's disappearance is convinced of Thomas Young's guilt, saying that he was disappointed that the investigation never went any further, as in his opinion, all the evidence pointed to Thomas Young. I wonder why the Crown Office didn't agree. What was this newly found evidence? I guess we'll never know now. And Pat's mum Mary and dad Matthew both died, heartbroken, and never having recovered from their daughter disappearing and the strain it put them under. While everyone believes confidently that Thomas Young was guilty of Pat McAdam's disappearance and murder, the same cannot be said about his conviction for the murder of Francis Barker, many believing that there was another man to blame for that, with retired Detective Superintendent Eddie McCusker saying in an article in the Daily Record on the 4th of December 2016 that it was actually Angus Sinclair who killed Francis Barker. This was following retired Detective Superintendent Eddie McCusker leading an investigation into Angus Sinclair's life, following his conviction of Helen Scott and Christine Eadie's murder in 2014, and new evidence that strongly linked Angus Sinclair to Francis Barker's murder apparently being found. The evidence being a similarity to how Francis was killed and how Angus Sinclair had killed his other victims. Plus, Angus Sinclair also lived a few hundred yards or metres from where Francis Barker had vanished, and he also fished near where her body was found. Angus Sinclair died in 2019, never having been charged with the murder of Francis Barker. Whether Thomas Young killed Francis Barker or not, he clearly had an issue with women and treated them absolutely appallingly. So whether he was convicted rightly or wrongly, it was for the best that he was off the streets sooner rather than later. I'm also sorry that if he did kill Pat McAdam, that he wasn't convicted of her murder too. Where was Pat's body that she's never been found? Was Gerard Quasi right when he eventually said that Pat's body had been washed out to sea? Speaking of Gerard Quasi and the psychic community in general, after listening to this case so far over these 4 parts, including the episode about Gerard Quasi and his psychic involvement, and the episode all about Thomas Ross Young and how so much more is known about him than Pat McAdam, I hope it's shown that while Pat McAdam was the victim, her disappearance and likely murder was hijacked again and again, despite her case being kept in the public eye for decades, by not only Gerard Quasi and his inability to find any clues or Pat, but also by Thomas Young and his horrific acts and behaviour. So when I came across articles in the Daily Record in September 1975 and again in March 1994, which stated that Pat's case was seen by experts in extrasensory perception and other paranormal phenomena as a classic, and that she was one of the most celebrated cases of the psychic detectives, it made me sad, especially as the article in 1994 seemed to be using Pat's case to sell a recently written book. Gerard Quasi didn't find Pat or her body. He found a dress that didn't belong to Pat. And yes, that's a bit strange. And yes, he said there would be an old car and a wheelbarrow near this dress, which, again, yes, I admit is strange. But he didn't find anything of Pat's. Nothing. Eventually saying that she had washed out to sea when all else failed. I know that having Gerard Quasi involved drew a lot of attention to the case, and that's great. But for experts in psychic phenomena to say that Pat's case is regarded as a classic just feels to me... I'll leave it there. What do you think? Am I overreacting? How did you feel as I was reading that out? If this was your relative or friend, would you like it to be seen as a classic psychic case? Or would you just have been grateful that it had drawn attention to the case? It made me feel a bit yuck, to be honest. But like I said, I'm a skeptic. I'd love to have spoken to Frank Ryan, the reporter who was also a skeptic before visiting and speaking with Gerard Quasi, but sadly he's no longer alive. As of this episode being released, it's been 58 years since 17-year-old, brown-eyed, vivacious and pretty Pat McAdam disappeared without a trace, and nobody has been brought to justice. So that's the end of the Pat McAdam episodes, and I really appreciate all your comments and feedback on these episodes, and all of our episodes. Before I end, just to let you know that at the weekend we're off to Cumbernauld Library, along with Marty from Mum's Mysteries and Murder, for their Killers and Coffee event, where we'll be telling another Scottish murder story. So there will be a week or two break before I release a Scotland Den episode from back in 1967, at the time Pat McAdam went missing, followed by more Scottish Murders episodes. So until then, I've been your host, Dawn.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.